Well, hello, class. Welcome to Chapter 2 in Introduction to Psychology. I'm going to walk you through the lecture slides for Chapter 2 as we look into psychology's scientific method. Chapter 2 is Psychology's Scientific Method. Scientific research is a critical tool for successfully navigating our very complex world. Without it, we would be forced to rely solely on intuition, the authority or words of other people, and even just blind luck. While many of us feel confident in our own abilities to decipher and interact with the world around us, history and certainly current events are filled with examples of how very wrong we can be when we fail to recognize the need for scientific empirical evidence in supporting factual claims. It is through systematic scientific research that we take away preconceived notions or biases and gain a more objective, more accurate understanding of ourselves and the world around us. We talked in Chapter 1 about science being the study of the natural world. So psychologists are going to focus their attention on understanding behavior, as well as the cognitive or mental and physiological or body processes that underline our behavior. As you remember, psychology is the scientific study of human behavior and mental processes. The hallmark of scientific research is that there is evidence to support a claim. Scientific knowledge is empirical. It's grounded in objective, tangible evidence that can be observed time and time again, regardless of who is making the observations. This chapter explores how scientific knowledge is generated and how important that knowledge is in forming decisions in our personal lives and in the public domain. In this chapter, you're going to see that we're going to talk a lot about the scientific method. And in doing so, you're going to have different terms that you're going to need to learn. We're going to talk about different types of research, and in our case, we're looking into human behavior and mental processes. We're also going to talk about sample sizes and the settings of research, the ethics of doing research, how one analyzes and interprets data that they collect, and as always, we'll be talking about critical thinking so that we can be a better consumer of factual information around us, but also that we can have a better apprehension of what's going on in the world around us. Scientific knowledge is advanced through a process known as the scientific method. Basically, ideas that are placed in the form of theories and hypotheses are tested against the real world, and those observations lead to more ideas that are tested against the real world, and so on. As we watch and observe and test, we're gathering information. In this sense, the scientific process is circular. The types of reasoning within this circle are called deductive and inductive. In deductive reasoning, ideas are tested in the real world, and in inductive reasoning, real-world observations lead to new ideas. So, in deductive reasoning, we take a hypothesis or general premise and then make some empirical observations on that hypothesis or premise. In inductive reasoning, we start with empirical observations, and then that leads us to a hypothesis or general premise. In the scientific context, deductive reasoning begins with a generalization, like a hypothesis, and then that hypothesis is used to reach logical conclusions about the real world. If the hypothesis is correct, then the logical conclusions reached through deductive reasoning should also be correct. Scientists, therefore, use deductive reasoning to empirically test their hypotheses. Deductive reasoning starts with a generalization that is tested against real-world observations. But inductive reasoning moves in the opposite direction. Inductive reasoning uses our empirical observations to construct broad generalizations or theories or hypotheses. Scientists use inductive reasoning to formulate theories, which in turn generate hypotheses that are tested with deductive reasoning. In the end, science involves both deductive and inductive processes. We've stated that theories and hypotheses are ideas, but what sort of ideas? Well, a theory is a well-developed set of ideas that propose an explanation for something that is observed in the real world. Theories are repeatedly checked against the world, but they tend to be too complex to be tested all at once. Therefore, researchers create hypotheses to test specific aspects of a theory. A hypothesis is a testable prediction about how the world will behave if our idea about the world is correct. And it's often worded as an if-then statement. The hypothesis is extremely important because it bridges the gap between the realm of thought and theory and ideas and the real, actual, observable world. As specific hypotheses are tested, theories are modified and refined to reflect and incorporate the results of these tests. Scientists, therefore, they're going to propose theories to try to explain the world around them. And a theory is a broad system of ideas that helps us understand the world and make observations and make predictions about how the world works. Now, scientific theories are going to be either rejected, supported, or otherwise edited or refined using the scientific method. So let's talk a little bit more about the scientific method. The scientific method has several steps. In step 1, we want to observe the world around us. So in step 1, we are observing some phenomenon in the world. We know from chapter 1 that we talked about curiosity and critical thinking and looking at the world around us and trying to understand the world. That is the passion of a psychologist, right? Why do people do what they do? In making an observation about the world, a psychologist might formulate a theory of why people do what they do, or otherwise challenge a theory of how the world works. So step 1 is taking a look around and observing what's going on. In step 2, we're going to get a little bit more specific than just our observations. We're going to make a hypothesis. And a hypothesis is a specific prediction of how the world could and should work. It is a testable prediction. Untestable predictions cannot be scientifically investigated. So if you're studying something that you can't actually observe or measure or otherwise collect data on, you really might have a hypothesis or an intuition, but that intuition might not be scientifically based. And since psychology is the scientific study of human behavior and mental processes, psychology really is going to stay within the realm of what is able to be tested. So a question like, what is the purpose of life? That's a big question. So that question might be more well suited for the discussions of philosophy or religion and faith. In psychology, we might be able to make it testable by surveying people and asking them what they think their purpose is, and maybe doing a study where we collect all their answers and we also collect their personality type, and we see if certain personality types cluster with certain types of answers. We're getting more testable there. We're getting more specific. That's more within the realm of scientific psychology. So in step 2, we're going to formulate a hypothesis and make some predictions about how the natural world works by creating a testable prediction. And hopefully, if science is doing what it should do, which is deductive and inductive processes folding upon themselves back and forth, general to specific, specific to general, going back and forth, if science is benefiting and editing itself and adding to itself, then that hypothesis should be derived from a pre-existing theory that has some track record and a history to it. Step 3 has to do with us actually testing through empirical research, actually testing the hypothesis. We want to figure out how exactly that hypothesis could be measured and could be studied. To do that, we have to be very specific of how we define our variables and our terms. We have to get very, very specific. So let's go back to my what is the purpose of life big question. Well, maybe I have a hypothesis that certain personality types have different answers to that question. I look through the literature and I find that certain types of personalities are more likely to have different views about the meaning of existence. So I might find in my research that there's actually a personality scale called the Meaningful Existence personality scale. People that rank high on that scale say that they have a great purpose for life, that they're living a life full of purpose. Well, wow. Hey, that's something testable. That's something concrete. That's something that I could do in survey form. So I could test my hypothesis. Let's say that my hypothesis is that outgoing people have a higher quality of life by way of feeling like they have more purpose in life. And so what I could do is I could operationalize outgoing and I could operationalize meaningful existence. In this case, I'm going to operationally define outgoingness as extroversion. So there are scales and years and decades of research on that personality trait. And then I'm also going to, for my purposes, define purpose in life as getting a high score on the meaningful existence sub-survey of that personality domain. So I'll have two variables, extroversion and meaningful existence. If my hypothesis is true, then the people that score higher on extroversion should score higher on meaningful existence. And I can analyze that and analyze the data using statistical procedures. This is the empirical approach. We're going to test my hypothesis. Okay, so let's say I've done this study, everything has come to a conclusion, and I have collected lots of data. I've collected it in different settings with different people across time. And I've got lots of data and lots of surveys of extroversion and lots of surveys of meaningful existence. And I have the paired scores, the scores that go together for each person. Well, after doing all that testing, we want to draw some conclusions about what the findings are from the study. Is our hypothesis supported? Do the results alter or support our original hypothesis or theory? Can we trust our conclusions? Can these findings be generalized to other people in other settings doing other activities? Well, one of the ways that we have more confidence in our conclusions is that we should be able to replicate the results. We should be able to see the same results if we were to do the study over. And so that's important because that means that we are looking for reliability. Reliability has to do with the nature of a test providing a consistent score. This reliability or consistency of our results is going to be important because if our results aren't consistent, then we need to start asking questions about why they're not consistent. And those evaluations in step 5 have to do with us taking it all together. We want to evaluate the theory. We want to evaluate our approach. We want to publish our results and share them with other scientists so that they can put them together with their own studies and own similar studies to see exactly what's going on. Peer review, for example, protects the field from biased or poorly designed research studies. Meta-analysis can help us understand broad trends in the data and also give us a good idea of what exactly is going on in the natural world of human behavior and mental processes. So let's talk about different types of research. There are many different research methods available to psychologists in their efforts to understand, describe, and explain behavior. Some methods rely on observational techniques. Other approaches involve interactions between the researcher and the individuals that are being studied. Each of these research methods has unique strengths and weaknesses, and each method may only be appropriate for certain types of research questions. So let's start with descriptive research. Descriptive research has one main overarching goal, and that is describing a psychological phenomenon. We call it descriptive because its basic approach has to do with observation. In the descriptive approach, you're going to use things like surveys, face-to-face interviews, and case studies. In observational research, scientists might conduct a clinical or case study when they focus just on one person or just a few individuals. Why would they do this? Obviously, when a scientist focuses their attention on a very small number of people, they can gain a tremendous amount of insight into those specific cases. The richness of information that is collected in clinical or case studies is unmatched by any other method. That's because it allows the researcher to have a very deep understanding of the individuals or the particular phenomenon being studied. It's important to note that in descriptive research, like case studies and clinical studies, it doesn't answer questions about why things are the way they are. It is about identifying issues. Oftentimes in descriptive research, you are finding out something that is rare or unusual. So you might get very specific research on a very rare medical phenomenon. That might not generalize to everybody, however. So although observation, naturalistic observation, descriptive research, case studies, individual surveys, individual interviews, although those things are very useful, they are pretty specific in their use. They provide us with information about usually rare or specific cases, and they could motivate us to do bigger or different studies on the same issue. So, although it can't answer why something is happening, it can identify some key issues or key factors that we should look into. Let's move forward to correlational research. Correlation means that there's a relationship between two or more variables. But this relationship does not necessarily imply cause and effect. When two variables are co-related, it simply means that as one variable changes, so does the other. We can measure correlation by calculating a statistic known as the correlation coefficient. That's Pearson's R. A correlation coefficient is a number from -1 to +1 that indicates the strength and direction of the relationship between variables. The number portion of the correlation coefficient indicates the strength of the relationship. So the closer that the number is to 1, whether it's -1 or +1, the more strongly related the variables are, and the more predictable changes in one variable will be as the other variable changes. The closer the number is to 0, that indicates a weaker relationship, and that means that it's a less predictable relationship between the variables. For example, a correlation coefficient of 0.9 is far stronger than a correlation coefficient of 0.3. If the variables are not related to one another at all, the correlation coefficient is 0. Now, the sign, positive or negative, of a correlation coefficient indicates the direction of a relationship. A positive correlation means that the variables move in the same direction. Put another way, it means that as one variable increases, so does the other. So in a positive correlation, the variables move in the same direction. Amount of hours that you study for Psychology 101 and grade in Psychology 101. As your numbers of hours go up, your grade goes up. And as your number of hours studied goes down, your grade goes down. That would be a positive correlation. A negative correlation means that the variables actually move in opposite directions. If two variables are negatively correlated, a decrease in one variable is associated with an increase in the other variable, and vice versa. So let's do a negative correlation example. So let's use the variable of your grade in Psychology 101. And let's make the other variable the amount of social media time that you have. In a negative correlation, as you increase hours on social media, you might decrease your grade in Psychology 101. And vice versa. As you decrease time on social media, you might increase your grade. And there are some examples on a slide that's labeled scatter plots. So a positive correlation, again, has to do with your variables. They vary reliably and they go in the same direction. As one goes up, the other goes up. As one goes down, the other goes down. For a negative correlation, however, the variables, they vary in opposite directions. As one goes up, the other variable goes down, and vice versa. So let's talk a little bit more about correlation. So just because two variables are correlated does not mean that one caused the other. And this is sometimes somewhat hard to understand. Correlational research is useful because it allows us to discover the strength and direction of relationships that exist between two variables. However, correlation is limited because establishing the existence of a relationship tells us very little about cause and effect. While variables are sometimes correlated because one does cause the other, it could also be that some other factor, we call this a confounding variable, is actually causing the systematic movement of our variables. We should not assume that variables that are correlated imply that one variable causes the other. While correlational research is invaluable in identifying relationships among variables, a major limitation is its inability to establish causality. So psychologists want to make statements about cause and effect, to say that this caused this, but the only way to do that really is to conduct an experiment to answer a specific research question. The only way to establish that there's a cause and effect relationship between two variables is to conduct a scientific experiment. So let's look a little bit at some of these example slides from your chapter. Why is parental harshness or being strict correlated with child rebellion? So we have our two variables. We have harshness or authoritarian parenting, we'll call it that. And then we have our other variable, which is child rebellion. So rebellion we could measure by way of tantrums and not following the rules. And parental style we could also measure with a survey or with some observations and classifications. So you have two variables, parental style and then child rebellion. So if we see a connection between how strict a parent is and how much a child rebels, let's imagine that it's a positive correlation, meaning that as a parent becomes more strict, the child rebels more. Well, option number one in trying to describe the correlation is maybe the harsh parenting style, it drives and influences the kids towards being more rebellious. Another explanation could be the opposite. Maybe it starts with the child, and more stubborn children elicit more harsh and strict parenting from their parents. Or maybe a third explanation might be viable. Maybe there's something about the home where the home is really stressed out for some reason, and when there is stress, you'll see both parents being very strict and kids rebelling because that's how both parties are acting out. Or maybe there's a genetic explanation. Any combination of any of those might be true or false. So just because parent style goes with child behavior, let's say that they're correlated, it doesn't settle why the behavior occurs. Perhaps there's a third variable. Perhaps there's other things involved that are causing both the parental style and the child's behavior. Since correlation does not equal causation, we have to do experimental research to determine causation. In order to conduct an experiment, a researcher must have a specific hypothesis to be tested. As you've already learned, hypotheses can be formulated either through direct observation or from careful review of the previous research and building upon other people's work. The most basic experimental design involves two groups, the experimental group and the control group. The two groups are designed to be the same except for one difference. The experimental group gets the experimental manipulation. That is, they get the treatment or variable that's being tested. And the control group does not get that special treatment or that special variable. Since experimental manipulation is the only difference in the experimental and control groups, we can therefore be sure that any differences between the two groups is due to that experimental manipulation rather than just chance. We also need to precisely define or operationalize how we measure our variables. An operational definition is a precise description of our variables, and it's important in allowing others to understand exactly how and what a researcher has measured in a particular experiment. So when we're talking about an operational definition of our variables, let's talk a little bit about independent variable and dependent variable. In a research experiment, we're trying to understand and study whether changes in one variable cause changes in the other variable. To achieve an understanding of whether there's a causal relationship between variables, we have to pay attention to the two variables, or the things that can be changed, in any experimental study. And those two variables are the independent variable and the dependent variable. To achieve this, we really have to understand the difference between the independent variable and the dependent variable. An independent variable is manipulated or controlled by the experimenter. In a well-designed experimental study, the independent variable is the only important difference between the experimental and control groups. We call it independent because it's independent of the participant in the study. They don't pick it. They don't choose which group they're in. Let's give an example of a drug study. So drugs have to be assessed by the FDA. They have to be measured for effectiveness. And in order to do that, you'll have to have an experimental group that has the actual drug, and then a control group that receives a placebo or a sugar pill that is not the drug, because we want to see the impact of the drug. And the only way to do that is to randomly assign people to either the experimental group that gets the drug, that's the independent variable in this case, and the control group that does not get the drug. The drug is independent of the participant in the sense that they don't pick which group they're randomly assigned to. Now, a dependent variable is what the researcher measures to see how much effect that the independent variable had on the dependent variable. So in our drug study, the outcome of the drug, let's say it's a reduction in symptoms, that is something that we're measuring, or it's a level of happiness or a level of function or a feeling or a rating of pain, less or more pain. The outcome is dependent on the participant's action or interaction with the independent variable. So the dependent variable is often an outcome or something that the participant conveys or displays. We expect that the dependent variable will change as a function of the independent variable. In other words, the dependent variable depends on the independent variable. A good way to think about the relationship between independent and dependent variables is with this question. What effect does the independent variable have on the dependent variable? That's what an experiment is trying to see. Just so you know, one study by itself would not forever end the issue. Multiple studies done by multiple researchers in different settings, times, places, and participants are going to be important for us to understand and build a body of science that is foundational and accurate. Speaking of accurate, we want to talk about something called validity. And validity has to do with the truthfulness or the accuracy of us testing what we said we would test. So reliability has to do with the consistency of results. So if I always get an A on my psychology exams, the reliability for me is that I'm consistently getting those A's. That's reliable. It's a consistent score. Validity has to do with us testing what we say we're testing. So if you take my psychology scores and my psychology knowledge and you pretend or say like, oh, that's her score on chemistry, they're not the same thing, right? The validity issue means that those grades being high are valid and accurate within psychology. I can't just say, well, hey, I got an A in chemistry, because that's not what I actually did. I did psychology, not chemistry. So if I try to say that my psychology grade is a chemistry grade and apply that grade over to that other topic, I'm not doing something very valid, not very accurate. That grade does not reflect a chemistry grade. It reflects a psychology grade. So there's two different types of validity that I want to talk about in regard to experimentation. One is external and the other is internal. So external validity has to do with how valid, how representative of what's actually going on are my experimental methods. Do my results generalize to the real world? Are they connected? Are they accurate? Do they reflect a real life scenario and real concerns? External validity refers to how well the outcome of a study can be expected to apply or generalize to other settings. External validity is threatened when a study does not take into account the interactions of variables in the real world. Situational factors like time of day, location, researcher characteristics, researcher bias, pre- and post-test, sample features, selection bias, who's in the study, who's not in the study. Those things could threaten the external validity of a study. Again, external validity has to do with how well the outcome of our study and the setup of our experiment has a reasonable expectation to generalize to the real world apart from just the study, apart from just our little experiment. Internal validity, on the other hand, has to do with the extent to which a study establishes cause and effect between the treatment and their outcome, or establishes a consistency between independent and dependent variable. What we're looking at here has to do with, is the dependent variable and how it changes as a result of the independent variable? Are we studying what we said that we're going to study? Or have there been logical errors or experimental bias or problems in the research method that we've employed? Confounds and historical events or generational effects, developmental effects, maybe testing procedures or lack of good testing procedures. Dropouts are people that start to participate but then leave the study. Or maybe even bias in the experimenter. Maybe the experimenter is doing something in the delivery of the study that is impacting the dependent variable. All of those could be threats to the internal validity of the research that we're trying to do. So let's talk a little bit more about some of those threats to the validity of our work. Experimenter bias refers to the possibility that a researcher's expectations might skew or influence the results of a study. Remember, conducting an experiment requires a lot of planning, and the people involved in the research project have a vested interest in supporting their hypotheses. They believe in those hypotheses. They put them together. If the observers knew which person gets the drug and which person gets the placebo pill, it might influence how they interpret the client's responses or interact with the clients. This situation might lead to some bias in our results. So what's the solution? Well, in a double-blind study, both the researchers and the participants are blind to which condition they're in. If they're part of this study, both the participant and the researcher don't know which person has gotten the drug, the actual drug, and which person has gotten the sugar pill or placebo. The reason for doing that is that we can control both experimenter and participant bias or expectations. So that's really important to control for experimenter bias or experimenter expectancy effects. And we'll talk a little bit more about expectancy effects in a later chapter. So let's move forward and talk a little bit more about research and sampling. After we've designed our study, let's imagine it's this great double-blind study where we have an experimental group that's going to get the drug that we're interested in testing, and a control group that gets the sugar pill. And we have our researchers and participants in a double-blind situation where they don't know which condition they're in. And we have our independent variable, which is drug, which is either drug or sugar pill. That's the independent variable. And then we have the outcome variable or the dependent variable, and that's going to be, we'll give them a survey on their level of happiness after administering the drug for 2 weeks. So we have dependent and independent variable. Now that that study is designed, we need to obtain a sample of individuals to be part of the experiment. Participants are the subjects of psychological research. And as the name implies, individuals that are involved in psychological research are active participants in the process, in the scientific process. Our hypothetical experiment with the drug study is going to need a sample of participants. And samples are used because populations are usually too large to involve every member in our particular experiment. If possible, we should use a random sample. And a random sample is a subset of a larger population in which every member of the population has an equal chance of being selected. Random samples are preferred because if the sample is large enough, we can be reasonably sure that the participating individuals are representative of that larger population. This means that the percentage of characteristics in the sample, sex, ethnicity, socioeconomic level, or any other sort of characteristics that might be important for the results, those characteristics are as close to the percentages in a larger population as they are in our smaller sample. Its characteristics are similar to the population, the larger population that we are studying. In a random sample, each individual in that population has an equal chance of being selected for the experiment. So if I only chose females for my drug study, I would not be doing a random sample, right? So if the sample is random, each individual in that sample should have an equal chance of being selected. And since I'm also randomly assigning them to the experimental group and the control group, I should have a different constellation. I'm not putting all the guys in the control group and all the girls in the experimental group. I'm randomly assigning them, so there should be a random distribution of characteristics and people across my experimental and control groups. And that's something called random assignment. With random assignment, all participants have an equal chance of being assigned to either the experimental group or the control group. And random assignment is critical for sound experimental design. With very large samples, random assignment makes it unlikely that there are systematic differences between a group. Random assignment allows us to assume that any differences observed between our experimental and control groups result from the manipulation of the independent variable, that's the drug, versus other random factors. Now we have to note that where you conduct your research, there are pluses and minuses to doing your research out in the real world versus a psychology department laboratory. In a laboratory, you're going to have a more controlled setting, so you'll be able to control your variables more accurately, more consistently, and basically protect the environment. But out in the real world, you would have a natural setting and be able to see some real engagement. So the answer of which is better really depends on what you're trying to study. In this drug study, we want to be pretty precise. We want to know for sure that the person has gotten a certain dosage and we can confirm that. So it really just depends on what your question is and what the research is in that area to determine which setting you're going to put your research in. Okay, so let's talk about analyzing and interpreting data. Once data is collected from both our experimental and control groups, we're going to do a statistical analysis to find out if there's any meaningful differences between our two groups. A statistical analysis determines how likely any difference between experimental and control groups, if we find that, if that's due to chance or if it's actually a real thing going on. Generally, psychologists consider differences to be statistically significant if there's less than a 5% chance of observing them in groups that actually did not differ from one another. Stated another way, psychologists want to limit the chances of making a wrong claim to 5% or less. So in this chapter, you're going to find some different statistics and some different measures that allow us to interpret data. You'll see mean, median, and mode, range, and standard deviation. All in all of those statistics allow us to analyze and interpret the data that we've collected. All right, let's move forward to research ethics. Any experiment involving the participation of human participants is governed by extensive, strict guidelines designed to ensure that the experiment does not harm them. Any research institution that receives federal support for research involving human participants must have access to an institutional review board. This is an IRB. And an IRB is a committee of individuals often made up of members of the institution's administration, scientists, and community members. The purpose of an IRB is to review proposals for research that involve human participants. The IRB is going to review these proposals with the principles of good informed consent, confidentiality, debriefing, not doing any harm, using deception as little as possible, and their approval is required in order for an experiment to proceed. So what are some of those guidelines? Each participant must sign an informed consent before they can participate. An informed consent provides a written description of what participants can expect during the experiment, including risks and implications. It also lets participants know that their involvement is voluntary and can be stopped at any time. If that data is collected with participants under the age of 18, parents or legal guardians are required to sign the informed consent form. Sometimes, however, deception might be necessary to prevent participants' knowledge of the exact research question from affecting their behaviors within the study. So deception is acceptable. We just keep it at an appropriate and minimal and non-harmful level. Deception obviously involves misleading experiment participants in order to maintain the integrity of what's being tested. In cases where deception is involved, participants must receive a full debriefing upon the conclusion of the study, complete, honest information about why the study was done, how data was collected, how data will be used, the reasons why deception was necessary, and information about how to obtain additional information about the study. All in all, at the end of this chapter, you'll see that there are some good suggestions for staying a good critical thinker within this class. So when you see psychological data or data reported on the news, in an article, on Twitter, on Instagram, you're seeing facts kind of flung at you and you see information coming your way, be careful. Avoid overgeneralizing results from one study to all studies. Read, if you can, the specifics of where the data that you're getting is coming from. Check your source. Look for converging evidence. Look for conflicting evidence. Question causal inferences. When someone says something causes something else, you look for the experiments to back that up. Use caution in applying group trends to an individual's experience. Just because something happens to a lot of people doesn't mean that it happens to every person. And all in all, be a good consumer of the scientific study of human behavior and mental processes. So why do we care about this, by the way? We care about this because if psychology is not a science, then it's just people's opinions or feelings or biases, right? Well, we care about it because psychology cares about the truth. And in order to get to the truth, we need to set aside our feelings, our biases, our expectations, and sometimes even our preconceived notions of what something should be. Something that is true should be able to be reliable and valid in its display. And if you ever get kind of bogged down in this chapter and it feels a little overwhelming, just remember this. Psychology is the scientific study of human behavior and mental processes. Doing science well, with an empirical mindset, that's how we get at truth. Okay, you guys, I'm really proud of you. I hope that you enjoy this chapter and that it helped you prepare for your homework number 1. Homework 1, as you know, covers chapters 1 and chapter 2. Wherever this lecture finds you, I'm so proud of you. I'm so glad that you're in my class, and I'll catch you next time. Good job.